Hello, everyone. I hope you all are doing good. So, as I mentioned earlier, that in my next couple of sessions, I'm going to cover about the general EDI and Sterling Integrator interview questions. So, let me quickly share my screen. Okay. So, in my career, right, working with companies starting from IBM as an application developer and then moving to technical lead positions and technical architect in companies like HCL, Wipro, Infosys, I have actually uh, uh, joined a lot of interview calls I have for either like fresh hiring or maybe even getting a new folk in your project, right? And as part of those technical interview calls, I have a general sense of what are the typical questions that I used to ask to the folks, right? Okay, who either were getting hired to the to the company as a fresher, or maybe as an experienced guy from working on EDI projects in his prior company, right? Or maybe an existing folk moving from one project to another. Now, typically, what I have observed based on my experience that I wanted to share with all of you is we start with generic EDI questions, right? So when I mention generic EDI questions, it's just the basics of EDI, right? To understand, to gauge the candidate, whether he knows the terminology, right, when it comes to EDI. So let me give you an example, right? When I'm talking about basics of EDI, I mean to say, typically the first question that I would ask is, what do you mean by EDI, right? What is EDI? We all know EDI, the full form of EDI is electronic data intelligence. What does that mean? What actually it helps to solve any business problem? What is the where do you use EDI, right? In which scenario, right? So those kind of questions. Then maybe once that is answered, right, appropriately, we go into a little bit more deep. Okay, when we talk about standards, right, like message standards within EDI, what are the different kind of standards, right? Do you know them? Like, what are the standards that you have worked with? Like, do you? And then the typical answers are like, oh, okay, I have worked on maybe EDIFACT documents, right? Let's say in a retail uh, scenario, right, it can be at 850 purchase orders, right? Or maybe 810 invoices, 856 dispatch advices, right? Those kind of things. Or maybe the candidate has worked on documents like trader comps, right? Or maybe uh, other kind of documents, right? Like ANSI X12. In X12, you have 850s and all that. In EDIFACT, you have like purchase orders, DESADEV, right? Invoice and all that. Now, in modern days, right, these days, other than the typical EDI standards that we have, like around X12, EDIFACT, Trader Comps, we do also deal with a lot of like different kind of XML documents, different kind of JSON documents, which are key value pairs, right? So you need to also understand the not only the EDI standards, but the other modern formats, right? Like those kind of like XML, CXMLs, right? Those kind of message standards. So you should be familiar with that, right? When it comes to basics of EDI. Now, the next question that I typically ask, or you can expect in an EDI interview, is you might be asked, like, can you explain EDI flow, how it works? Just take any example, right? And just give me high level end-to-end flow, right, when it comes to EDI. So then you will start with like definitely you will talk about like there is a sender system, there is a receiver system, right? And then how do they communicate with each other, right? What are the protocols? You might mention what protocols, right? You might talk about if you want to focus on maybe like you have experience in Sterling Integrator, you might want to talk about like how do you implement the Sterling Integrator, right? Just very high level. So maybe you will explain the overall EDI flow sending a document, getting an acknowledgement, and all that, right? So that's kind of the usual flow. Now, uh, then we also like maybe when you talk about different kind of standards, right? We might ask you, can you explain me a typical envelope structure, right? For X12 and 85, what's the difference, right? Those kind of questions, right? So you can anticipate those. Maybe at a protocol level, right? What is the difference between FTP and SFTP and FTPS, right? So you need to be aware of the difference between these different protocols that are being used in traditional B2B products, right? So expect this kind of questions, right? When it comes to basics of EDI. Now, moving on, okay, slowly, like once we gauge that, okay, this candidate has a good amount of like understanding of how EDI works, okay, what are the different kind of message standards, what is an EDI flow, okay, we understand, yeah, he's kind of good in that, okay, let's move to a specific application, right, or a product, right, which based on his resume, he mentioned that he has some experience in, right? So now we slowly start transitioning to that specific product, right? So for this conversation, I've taken Sterling B2B Integrator. It might be a different product, like maybe an Axway product, right? Axway interchange, right? Those kind of things. Or maybe it can be like other products like web methods, right? It can be Seaburger, right? So it can be any, right? Like there are like a lot of B2B products these days in the market, but specific to Sterling B2B Integrator, we slowly start transition to B2B Integrator. And when we talk about Sterling B2B Integrator, okay, typically within B2B Integrator, we have three key, I would say, pillars, right? Like the first thing is when we start assessing a candidate in respect to his or her expertise in Sterling Integrator, we focus on the mapping part of it. That's the first thing, right? And I have seen in my career most of the resumes, if not like maybe 90% of resumes that I've got, most of the those 90%, okay, like resumes are heavily focused on mapping experience. Okay, I have mapping experience from any to any mapping, right? Maybe a flat file to a CSV, maybe a flat file to an X12 document, right? Or maybe vice versa, right? So a lot of mapping experience in those resume, and very less I have seen cases where a candidate has experience both in mapping as well as business process development, right? And I know I understand the reason behind that, right? Typically, the freshers or maybe a person who has like 2 to 3 or 5 or 6 years of experience, when they actually start working on any EDI project coming out of the college as a fresher, I have seen even myself, like I have experienced the same thing. You get to work on the mapping part of it, right, in a project, because when it comes to business process development, those are like considered as like a kind of a taboo, but those are considered as the higher level tasks, okay, that a fresher may not be able to deliver, right? Okay, with all the uh, like perfect development, okay, perfect workflows and all that, right? It takes some time to create that or build that mental model to even start developing a business process from scratch, right? I've seen a lot of resumes. I've heard from a lot of folks, okay, in those interview calls mentioning that I do have very good experience in mapping. I have experience also in business process, but then what kind of business process experience? Maybe they already have some existing business processes within the product. They might have done some small changes in respect of the configuration, maybe added one or two services to that, or maybe changed some configurations. Right? That's it, right? Like they have no experience, okay, in building a business process ground up, right? So that's kind of where I see a lot of candidates like getting rejected, because when it comes to a Sterling integrator project, okay, you need to have experience both in mapping as well as business process, right? Like that's critical, right? So I would so now talking about like Sterling B2B integrated mapping experience or questions. Typically, what we do, we start with understanding like the different kind of rules, right? Like, do you have experience? What kind of different kind of rules you have in installing map integrator, right? Uh, then it might come to, okay, yeah, I know there are like standard rules, there are extended rules, pre-session, post-session. Okay, now we stop there, right? And then we go into trying to deep dive into each and every rules. Like, let's say, okay, what do you mean by standard rule, right? Can you give me an example, right? That's kind of the first level question, right? And then when he is able to explain that confidently, right, what is a standard rule, then probably we go to what is the extended rule, right? Can you give me an example? When do you want to, how do you define, right? Okay, when you get a requirement, when you get a mapping requirement specification document, like when I talk about mapping requirement specification or in small MRS, it basically is an Excel sheet, or it might be a Word document where you have the source structure, the source fields, you have the target fields, right? And you have the business rules, like, okay, there might be one-to-one mapping, like you just pass data from one source field to the target field without no transformation. There might be some business rules attached to some particular field mapping, right? Maybe, okay, if this is the qualifier, right, map this field to the corresponding target field. If this is the qualifier, okay, then do that, right? Okay, or maybe append, prepend something, right? So there might be specific business rules attached to certain, and that's not one-to-one mapping, right? There is some kind of transformation, okay, that you're doing before you are passing that information and mapping it to the target field. And so typically, like when we talk about extended rule and standard rule, we ask that question, okay, how do you, from a requirement point of view, how do you define, okay, how do you understand that I have to use standard rule and in which scenario, okay, I have to use business rules, right? So that's that you have to be confident in explaining that, right? When do you want to use that? It's just not saying an example, right? But also giving an example of like how do you decide like which one to prioritize. Now, after talking about this, okay, now based on your answers, right, we can ask more deeper dive questions like, okay, what do you mean by code list, right? What do you mean by accumulator, right? What is the meaning of trim function, right? Things like that. So it can go very. I'm not going in that depth right now, but you get my point, right? So that's important. Now, on a high level, right? Now moving from standard rule to extended rule, right? Okay, maybe I might ask a question, right? Where do you initialize variables that you're going to use in your map, right? In the map editor, right? And I've seen like folks kind of stumbling into that question. Okay, they don't have any idea, or they might have an idea, things like that. So maybe need some hand holding, right? Okay, just to guide. Okay, do you know what is session rules, right? Okay, if you know, okay, what are the different kind of session rules? So you need to say, okay, I know there is a pre-session rule, there's a post-session rules. What's the difference between that, right? Okay, you need to be aware of that, right? So these are some of the basic questions that I can think of, okay, when it comes to understanding that whether that person has really done some mapping in his career, right? And then if you're able to understand, okay, yeah, let's keep moving, right, through this, okay, rather than rejecting, okay, based on the experience I had so far with this candidate, maybe I might go to a question, okay, can you tell me how do you like once you've written a map, let's say, right? How do you compile it, right? Do you know how to compile it? Okay, well enough, you know how to compile it. Okay, what are the parameters that you how do you do unit testing, for example? Like, what are the parameters that goes like? So you need to be able to answer that, right? Those things. So from a unit testing point of view, right? You're testing in your desktop. Now, if you're able to answer that, the next question is, okay, you have done your development, you have done your unit testing, you are satisfied with the output. Okay, you have an output structure that kind of aligns to what you're expected from the map output. Now you need to be able to deploy this map in your dev environment or maybe your staging environment, right? How do you deploy it? How do you deploy a map? So you need to be very conversant about like mentioning, okay, that what is the file that you get, the .mxl file, right? In your local, and then the .txo file, the compiled version of that, right? And then how do you like, so you need to be able to explain, you need to log into the dashboard of Sterling Integrator, then you should be able to use the mapping tab, right, where you have all the maps, the translation maps. You need to be able to upload the both the mxl as well as the txo file, right, with some description, with proper naming convention of the map, right, and you should be able to then upload that file into the Sterling Integrated dashboard. So you need to be familiar with the process, right, to show that you know the things, right, what you are mentioning in your resume. So that's very important. Now, I'll like conclude here for the part one of this interview questions. In the part two, I'm going to cover about the specific business process development related questions and some of the administration related questions, right? In our part two, I don't want to make this a lengthy one, so let's conclude here. Thank you.